Hallo alle sammen, og velkommen til Månedens Møte med Morten. Og i dag skal vi snakke om apartheid. Vi har snakket om apartheid før på Månedens Møte med Morten, men det som har skjedd siden sist er at det har kommet en ny rapport utgitt av Amnesty International som anerkjenner at Israel utfører et apartheidregime mot palestinerne, som gjør at dette temaet nok en gang blir aktuelt. Så i dag har vi med oss to personer som skal snakke til oss om dette, som har god innsikt og kunnskap om temaet. Så nå vil jeg skifte til engelsk, slik at de forstår hva jeg sier. So, I just said welcome to everyone, and I would like to introduce our two speakers here today. So we have Ronnie Barkan, an Israeli activist and co-founder of Boycott from Within, and one of the humbled three. I guess you can say something about that maybe later if you'd like. So welcome, and thanks for taking the time to come and joining the monthly meeting with Morten this month.
Thanks for having me.
And also we have Itai Mack, human rights attorney and human rights defender from Israel. So thanks a lot for joining us, Itai. You're living in Norway, but you haven't quite picked up the language yet, I understand. So we're going to start with you, Ronnie, to talk a little bit about the Amnesty Apartheid report. I know you've been you've talked about it online on your, and you discussed this together with all the other reports that's been published lately, and I mean way back in time, really. So I think I'll just let you take the word, and so yeah, we're looking forward to listening to what you have to say.
Okay, wonderful. So hi everyone. First of all, I'm very happy to share the stage here with Itai and with you, Morten. And I think that I have to praise Itai for the excellent work that he's doing. And I would have loved him to start because he could give us like the framework, the legal framework, but I'd like to hear what the legal scholar has to say about apartheid and as it applies to Israel. When we talk about Israeli apartheid, it is very, very important to ask, what is the scope of apartheid? What is the geography that apartheid is practiced in? Who are the people affected? And when did it start? And just simply asking that question already basically frames everything that I would like to say about the situation. The Amnesty International report, which was published recently, early February, is actually is a milestone in the sense that almost for the first time, but it is the first of this caliber of organizations that has actually framed apartheid in the right way. What do I mean? I mean that the Zionist race state, also known the State of Israel, was founded as an apartheid state from the grounds up. Also, it practices also many other crimes, including colonialism and pillage and ethnic cleansing. But this is all inherent to the foundation of the State of Israel. But from the get-go, from its very first steps, it needed to first ethnically cleanse the land from its indigenous people, and immediately afterwards create a whole legal framework and also the practice that goes along with that, which all neatly falls under the legal definition of the crime of apartheid. And also the social understanding of what apartheid means, which basically means that there is one ethnic racial group that is being regarded by the law and in practice as superior to others, and practices in a systemic way basically control and domination over other groups based on racial ethnic characteristics. And this is exactly to the T what the Zionist race state is all about. So the Amnesty report basically starts off from the very beginning of the report. It discusses the foundational elements of the State of Israel, rather than that occupation of 1967, which came 19 years later after the state was already founded. It already focuses on the actual issue. Now, why is this important? First of all, because there are many more people that we have to account for when we talk about Israeli apartheid as Israel was founded, rather than only the later occupation, and those people who are to this day under this brutal military occupation. And secondly, because apartheid is not just any crime, it is a crime against humanity under the law, on par with genocide. And that means that no country in the world is actually should allow this to happen, and they are bound actually to take action against that, just as in the case of genocide. Certainly, countries and institutions should not cooperate and give a green light to the ongoing practice of such crimes against humanity. So this also obviously places a big question mark on the legitimacy of the Zionist race state, and I refer to it as it should be regarded as the Zionist race state in Palestine, which is also called the State of Israel. You can also call it Palestine. It's the exact same spot of land. But there was a race state that was established on top of Palestine at the expense of its indigenous population. And it practices all kinds of crimes and all kinds of different practices towards the different groups under its control and domination. And all this whole system of domination and control and oppression and terror against the civilian population, especially the indigenous people of that land, all of it falls under the definition of apartheid. Apartheid is a system, as I mentioned before. It is a system that has different manifestations. It has different aspects depending on where you look. So first and foremost, I mentioned that there are those people who have been expelled from their land in 48 when the state was founded. Also later on, there was later expulsions, also in 67. And even to this day, we see ethnic cleansing and expulsion taking place. This is an ongoing thing. It has actually, the ethnic cleansing of Palestine has never ceased, has never stopped for one day. It is part and parcel of the foundational element and the thinking behind the State of Israel. So those who have been expelled during the foundation of the state have been denied the right to come back home ever since. And that also means that the crime of apartheid that the Zionist race state practices also applies to them, even if they are outside of that territory, to them and to their children and grandchildren and so on. So, and I take this statement from another very important report on Israeli apartheid, the one written by Professors Richard Falk and Virginia Tilley, the UN Commission report on apartheid, UN ESCO report. I made a little table, kind of just before the show here. I made a little table, kind of detailing the different reports that I'm familiar with, and just to kind of put it in context. I don't know if we have, if you want to do this now or maybe a little later, kind of just to have a visual comparison of this report versus that report for the audience to be able to see that there have been different reports. Not all of them speak the same language. Not all of them carry the same meaning. And the meaning here and the framing of what do we mean when we discuss Israeli apartheid is extremely important. This is crucial.
I think it would be a good idea to show it now, and then we can put everything in context and see it as the historical fact that all of these reports entail. Because of course the Amnesty report is not alone. It's just the last report in a rather long line of reports and the decisions.
Okay, so I'm using this for the first time. Let me just see if I can.
I'll just use the moment to tell everyone that if you have any questions or any comments, please fill them out in the comments field, and we will address them when we find it suitable in the program. So.
Okay, I see that I can only share a PowerPoint presentation, so that means that I will have. Oh, I can also share my screen. Okay, so maybe we'll do that. Just one second. Let me get the report. Okay. Let's try that. I hope you can see that.
Here we go. We got it.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay, great. Now, there is much that I can say, and I don't want to talk too much about the differences and all the different things that I try to convey in this table, only to show that there have been quite a few reports. At least these are the ones that I'm familiar with, and I put them in chronological order. But not all of them speak the same language. Not all of them refer to the same thing, even though they all speak about apartheid. And this falls into also another related topic, which is the whole liberal Zionist discourse about the state of Israel, about the so-called conflict between Israel and Palestine. Even though there is no conflict, there is, as I mentioned, a system of domination, oppression, and terror. And in that liberal Zionist discourse, there is a clear distinction between the way that the Zionist state was founded, which seems to be legitimate in their view, and they even call it a thriving democracy, or Israeli democracy, fighting for democracy, and so on. And then there is the later stage, the later occupation of 1967, where they actually point the finger at and try to change that. And whenever they discuss apartheid, they only talk about that, the military occupation of the West Bank and Gaza. Also, East Jerusalem is in this special territory status, and whenever they discuss apartheid, it is much more convenient for them to talk about that, but not about the rest. We see in later years, in recent years, that now whenever the same people discuss apartheid, they also bring into the discussion whatever Israel is doing inside, what is regarded as Israel proper, or what we call Palestine 48. But still, in a very there is a very limited discussion about that. But hardly no one, other than the very recent Amnesty International report and the excellent UN report of 2017, all the others do not actually place the focus also on the refugees, those who have been in forced exile for the past 7 decades. When in the UN report, when they discuss the people who are affected by Israeli apartheid, they break it down into different domains. And there are those who are second-class citizens in Israel. There are those who are under military occupation. There are those who are residents of East Jerusalem. And finally, and most importantly, we should say, there are those who are in forced exile for the past 7 decades, denied the right to even go back to their home, simply for the so-called crime of wrong ethnicity, simply because they were born into the wrong ethnicity. So very quickly, what do I mean in this table that you see in front of you? I wrote down the focus. What does the report focus on? Does it focus on 48, meaning the entire, let's say the scope and the date? You see both focus and scope and date, it means similar things here. What is the focus of the report, and does it acknowledge, this is what I mean by scope and date, does it acknowledge that actually things started even before where the report focuses on? So you see there are some reports that focus on what is happening, what Israel practices in the 67 territory, what is regarded as the occupied Palestinian territories, but they also acknowledge that the scope of the date and the date of apartheid actually started earlier. Then who is the population that is being affected? Do they consider everyone, those who are under military occupation, those who are second-class citizens inside what is regarded as Israel proper, who also suffer the consequences of Israeli apartheid? And finally, and most importantly, those who are in exile. So do they consider all of them or only part of that population? And the geography, where is Israeli apartheid implemented? So when I write Palestine, I mean from the river to the sea. Also, you can call it Israel if you want. When I write Palestine and beyond, I mean that apartheid, it is acknowledged that actually apartheid even applies to those Palestinian refugees who are currently in Norway. And they are denied to this day the right to go back to Palestine if they so wish. When I write Palestine 67, these are the occupied territories. So I think, without going too much into detail, that you see that there is a clear distinction here, or a clear difference between the different reports. And I don't know if we will even have time to talk about the language. So, for example, if we take the Human Rights Watch report, which is somewhere in the middle here. The Human Rights Watch report, oh, sorry, I can't see it here for some reason. Okay, my bad. Anyway, there is also another report that I cannot, that is out of the picture, the Human Rights Watch report that was published also recently. They have done, to their credit, they have done the research. And here, go back. To the credit of Human Rights Watch, they have done the research. And if you read the report carefully, you will be able to see all the different aspects of Israeli apartheid, both within the occupied territories and also what Israel practices, and also towards the refugees. But the framing of the report, even the title of that report, they call it a threshold crossed. I think this is the correct title. A threshold crossed, Israeli authorities and the crime of apartheid and persecution. So even just by that, what does it mean, a threshold crossed? They mean that Israel has crossed the threshold of apartheid. It has not been apartheid until now, and finally we conclude that it has become, or it is becoming, an apartheid state. And I have great issues with that. They have done the research. They have documented quite a few of the crimes that Israel carries out towards the Palestinians, but they have chosen to speak a certain language as if we are only reaching apartheid now because of what is happening in the occupied territories. And if you want to get the real analysis, or if you want to get a real sense of what Israel is doing, and you read that report, I would suggest reading it bottom to top. Each section, just read it from the bottom to the top, because the most important aspects are written at the bottom, and the less important, the ones that relate to that occupation of 1967, which is a harsh and brutal military occupation, but it is not even the main issue. These are the ones, the issues that they focus on. Even when they sent a letter to Netanyahu, who was the prime minister, they sent a letter with different questions there, I think 11 questions there. Question number 10 is about the refugees. Everything that's above is relating to that harsh military occupation. But finally, the issue about the refugees, the issue about denying citizenship, denying status from different groups of Palestinians is always mentioned at the end, rather than why don't we mention it at the beginning? First of all, these are even by numbers. This is probably one of the largest groups that is being affected. Secondly, it is affected for the longest. And thirdly, this stems from the very foundational element of that state, which from its very beginning, from the birth of that state, they needed to create, basically by law and obviously in practice, these two levels, one of the privileged group that Itai and I belong to, and the other of the underprivileged group, whether they are totally expelled from their land or still remaining on their land, but denied equal rights and equal standing. We can hear you.
I unmute myself, sorry. It seems like this is my first meeting. No, I think it's interesting that you mentioned the title of the Human Rights Watch, Threshold Crossed, and to lift the point that apartheid is a regime that's the whole state, the whole Jewish democracy is a description of a state that excludes rather than includes, and the fact that the apartheid term actually goes further than just the different crimes, because of course I think a lot of people have a hard time understanding the term apartheid, right? What is it, and when does it apply? And I think actually it's a good idea to now just go further to you, Itai, and to talk about the details of what is apartheid and how do we when do you recognize apartheid and just educate us a little bit about this, and then we can have the discussion a little bit when you're finished. Go deeper into the different questions. So Itai, please.
So thank you for having me. So I'm happy to be here with Ronnie, and of course it's uncomfortable because there's no Palestinian here. So we are two Israelis and Norwegians, so I do my best in Israeli explaining, like mansplaining. I think when we talk about apartheid, first, it's important to remember that the Palestinians kept arguing this from the beginning. And until year 67, most of Israel foreign relationship and diplomacy was focused on encouraging other countries to vote with it, or at least to be absentee in votes concerning the Palestinian refugees. And to do that, Israel established between already, the earliest I found is just, I think, 52 years, 1952. Until 67, Israel sold weapons and training and established an intelligence unit of varied regimes. Many of them committed war crimes and crimes against humanity, to convince them to vote with Israel on the subject of the Palestinian refugees. After 67, the focus was transferred to convince all the dictatorship and other countries to vote with Israel about the occupied Palestinian and Syrian and Egyptian territories. In both cases, both the Palestinian refugees and the occupation of the Palestinian territories, the card that Israel tried to use is to say the solution must be through a negotiation. And of course, negotiation in Israel term and a never-ending negotiation. And between 67 until the collapse of the apartheid regime in South Africa, there was a lot of focus about the Israeli and the South African regime, also in the connection of the support in Israel to the apartheid in South Africa, but this relationship that was based on military training and military equipment and surveillance equipment, and also nuclear power, nuclear weapons, also put a focus on the Israeli apartheid regime in the Palestinian territories. Israel tried to silence this criticism by claiming that the ones that try to make a parallel between the Israeli regime to the South African regime is an anti-Semitic argument. But through all these years, there was a lot of focus. There was discussion in the UN Assembly and other international forum about how Israel is conducting an apartheid regime and how Israel is treating the Palestinian Israeli citizens. And after the collapse of the apartheid regime in 94, we are talking about the Oslo Agreement, which Israel hoped that it will help to ease the international pressure on it. What's interesting is that in the year 2001, there was the famous Durban conference that despite Israel hope that the Oslo Agreement will manage to stop all the naysayers and stop all the criticism on its policy concerning the Palestinian, already in the beginning of 2000, it was clear that the Oslo Agreement only worsening the situation of the Palestinian, and there was the famous conference in Durban that 3 days after it was finished, there was the 9/11 terrorist action in the US. And then the world forgot about it, and what we see, Ronnie showed us the timeline of the report by the different organizations, is that parallel to the extreme policies of the Netanyahu government, Netanyahu became a second time prime minister in 2009, and with each year passing, his ruling become less democratic and more extreme. Suddenly the narrative of the apartheid returned, and suddenly you see around the year 2000, the international organization started again to put a focus on the apartheid discourse. So you see report by B'Tselem, by Yesh Din, Israeli organization, by Human Rights Watch, and now by Amnesty International. And each one of them has different definition of apartheid, if it's big or small and what included in it. But you cannot separate the discussion about apartheid with the political discourse and the understanding that Israel is first, that there's no any more peace discussion between Israel and the Palestinian, and also that Israel is abusing the never-ending negotiation to deteriorate the situation of the Palestinians. So I think you cannot separate the discussion of apartheid with the political problems, and also I think this is one of the sophistication of the Israeli regime, both in the occupied Palestinian territories and inside Israel. Israel's sophistication is not only to separate the different Palestinian communities, whether are inside Israel, if they are in the south of Israel, if they are in East Jerusalem, in the West Bank, in Gaza, if they are refugees in Jordan or Lebanon, or if they got status in Europe or Latin America. Each group of Palestinians has separate circumstances, and this make it harder for them to organize politically, but it also make Israel life easier to convince its supporter in Western countries that its policies are not reaching the level of apartheid. So I think when we reach to this point, I think most legal scholars will agree that the situation in the West Bank does reach the point of apartheid, and you see that this is a point that is being shared by I think most of the human rights organizations and researchers that are looking objectively on that point. But inside of Israel, I think it will be much harder to convince because of the especially how we imagine what is apartheid, and the imagination is the situation in South Africa. So I think because of the difficulty to and the reference to the apartheid in South Africa, it's more easy to convince legal scholars and diplomats and activists. Situation in the West Bank, it's reached the point of apartheid, and inside of Israel, things are much more complex. And on that, I want to add that one of the difficulties with the argument of Amnesty report is that I think if we understand that the solution will have to be politically, so there was a question, what will be the legal consequences for a political solution? So for example, if the Palestinian Authority or the Palestinian political representative are ready to get to a compromise with Israel on the right to return, never mind if it's through compensation or through a limited number of refugees that are able to return. So are the Palestinian people representative are committing by themselves, are joining Israel in the crime of apartheid? So I think there are very complex question here, but the bottom line is that you cannot separate artificially the political discourse and the legal discourse, because roots are very attached. So I think what will be interesting now is to see what will be the next move. What will be the response of the UN and the committee that is now doing investigation on Israel, and what will be the discourse in the ICC. If the ICC will want to widen its investigation also to the crime of apartheid. So it will be interesting if the report of Amnesty would move this discussion forward, or that it will stay as like a discussion in a closed circle between a human rights organization and activists. And Palestine, I'm also not sure that all the Palestinians would have signed on the report of Amnesty, and I will explain it because I saw many arguments in different websites. We should give up on the discussion about occupation. So first, Amnesty is not saying that. The report is about the question of apartheid. They are not giving up on the question of occupation. But the problem is that because Israel so succeeded in splitting the Palestinians, I believe that there were many Palestinians that are not ready to give up on the cart of the occupation discussion, because this was already established in dozens of UN Security Council resolution. Many countries around the world support the two-state solution, and many Palestinians think that if Israel leave the territories of 67, it might make their life better. So the political question here are very important, and there's a question of representation. How there could be representation for all the separate Palestinian group in this discussion.
Thank you, Itai. I just want to dig into the last bit you said there, just so I understand it correctly. So you're saying about the discussion of the occupation. Is this the two-state versus one-state discussion you are talking about here, or is it something else?
I think that after the report of Human Rights Watch, Amnesty, and the growing movement of recognizing the definition of apartheid as relevant to the 67 or to all 67 and 48, there are some voices that saying we need to stop talking about the occupation. Let's only talk about apartheid. But I think that because the Palestinian people are so separate, so there are different interests and different groups. So of course, for the refugees, this is the main issue, the right for return. But for many Palestinians that are living in the West Bank, I think they are not ready so fast to give up on the discussion of occupation, because most of the international community is not recognizing Israel as a whole as the apartheid state, but now they recognize the occupation of 67 as illegal. So I think there are many Palestinians that say that still think we should still focus on the card of finishing the occupation and the legal discourse and the illegality of the 67 occupation. It doesn't mean that by doing that we must be silenced also on 48, but let's not give up on that. But I think there's, as I said, like there's a problem of representation. Who is representing the Palestinian people? If the Palestinian Authority or other groups are signing a peace agreement or whatever with Israel, what is the meaning of that? Because so it will stop the apartheid crime, or will it not? Will they be participant in the apartheid crime? So what the meaning of that? The Palestinians are not able politically to get to any solution with Israel. So it raises very complex questions that I think you cannot separate them from the discussion, the legal discussion. And I think because it's so complex, you will see that many legal scholars will avoid even joining the discussion.
Yes, of course. I'll bring Ronnie in here as well. I don't know, Ronnie, if you want to react on what Itai said.
Yeah, of course, I will duke it out with Itai later. But I think that it is very interesting because also, I mean, he has his analysis, which is strictly legal based, etc. And what we have to say is that, first of all, from the legal perspective, apartheid is not limited to 67. Actually, what I claimed before is that the apartheid regime started and is first and foremost that which exists throughout Palestine and also beyond, but at least throughout that land. And focusing only on the occupation of 67 because that is the most convenient part, or because there is some global recognition that there is apartheid there, is simply not good enough. It is simply like saying that there is only in South Africa there was only apartheid in this or that Bantustan, rather than throughout South Africa. Whether it was the white parliament in apartheid South Africa not part of the apartheid regime? Isn't the Knesset just as much an apartheid parliament? By the way, personally, I feel that it is far more important for me to refuse voting to that apartheid parliament than refusing to be a terrorist in the Israel terror forces, uniformed terrorists. So, because I feel that lending any legitimacy to that system, for example, by voting to that parliament, is already far more detrimental to the Palestinian cause, because it lends legitimacy to something that is inherently so illegitimate. It is based on the very, this white supremacist model that was created in 48. Lending it legitimacy, this is what allows it to carry on. And that is why throughout the world, people focus on 67, because this is the more convenient stuff. This is what the liberal Zionist propaganda, which also some of the apartheid reports that I mentioned, actually they regurgitate that liberal Zionist propaganda. They only speak about 67. They speak about Israel and Palestine. They speak about Israeli democracy. All of these fictitious ideas that simply did not exist. Israel has created apartheid in a way that was, in a way, more sophisticated than that of South Africa. By the way, they started at the exact same time. They both established apartheid in 48. But while the South African case was a very clear case of discrimination, racial-based discrimination, in Israel they built a two-tier system where one tier is seemingly democratic. There is some democratic game that is being played, while the far more important tier is that of racial supremacy. And whenever there is a conflict between the two, always, and Itai knows that as a lawyer in Israel, always that supremacist tier will win the argument. If I may share with you something that I think is, I think that kind of encapsulates what I'm trying to say here. Just one second. Yes, this is a direct quote from the Israeli embassy, and it relates to the question of Israeli citizens, and basically the Israeli embassy was asked about the status of a child born to Israeli parents, and they say very clearly that actually there are two laws governing the life of a baby from its very first day. And it all depends on whether that baby is the child of Jewish Israeli parents or non-Jewish Israeli parents, meaning, by the way, when we say Jewish, we never regard it as a religion. It's always a matter of ethnicity. Israel uses and abuses the term Jewish to differentiate between people based on their racial ethnic characteristics. So this is the direct quote from the Israeli embassy. They say, every Jew being born in Israel is a citizen under the law of return. This is one law. which is the first law that was legislated, and it is racist, explicitly racist. We can talk about that. For that matter, an Israeli Arab born in Israel is a citizen by virtue of birth. The fact is that there are two citizenship laws, two ways to receive citizenship for Israeli citizens, or for the babies, the children of Israeli citizens, based on their racial ethnic characteristics. So from the very first day of their life, there are two paths for the privileged and for the underprivileged population, who are both Israeli citizens, but clearly not equal citizens. This is just one example how Israeli apartheid operates. They can vote to the parliament, but their vote means absolutely nothing or very little. They cannot vote to abolish racial domination, to abolish apartheid. They can vote for other things. And I'd like to comment about what Itai mentioned about the right of return and about Mahmoud Abbas speaking on behalf of the Palestinian Authority. You know, that he approached the his liberal Zionist allies several times, like the Meretz party, etc. Many times he said very clearly that he said, I know that you are afraid of the right of return. This is something that worries you. So I, Mahmoud Abbas, am willing to renounce the right of return on behalf of Palestinians. Unfortunately for him, for Abbas, the only right of return that he can renounce is his own personal right to return to Safed, because this is also a personal right. Again, from the legal perspective. But other than that, obviously, the right of return, first of all, it is crucial. It is the heart of everything that we are talking about. And secondly, when we talk about that system of racial domination will not be abolished, cannot be abolished without demanding the rights of all the people, including, obviously, those who have been kept in exile for the past 7 decades.
Definitely. I just want to, very many interesting points there, Ronnie, I think. I just want to make sure that we have everyone with us when we use different terms. So can you just please explain liberal Zionism? Because I think there's a couple of concepts that we have to bring with us into this discussion, right? Colonialism, it's apartheid, Zionism, liberal Zionism, and then we can start going into all the different tiers of. But could you just please explain the difference between liberal Zionism and Zionism?
Yes, I'll give you the short version, and then what Itai will have to say about that. I'm only aware of two types of Zionists in the world. I never came across a third option. One type are the ones who are racist and proud of it. These are the ones that we call right-wing Zionists. This is also the Netanyahu government, former Netanyahu government, and so on. They are unashamed of their racism. People like Benny Morris, who actually helped to uncover the crimes of the Nakba, of the ethnic cleansing of Palestine, he said in an interview, he said very clearly that Ben Gurion's greatest mistake was that he hasn't finished the job, that he hasn't cleansed the entire land of Palestinians, that there are still Palestinians left in Palestine, and therefore it would have been much better, and he says more peaceful, if all Palestinians would have been ethnically cleansed already in 1948. This is what Benny Morris thinks. He acknowledges the Nakba, he acknowledges the ethnic cleansing, and he says sometimes ethnic cleansing is a good thing. This is the view of right-wing Zionists. Okay, by the way, I can agree to a far greater extent with those right-wing Zionists because we have some basis to agree on, or we can agree on the facts. We don't agree about morals, we don't agree about values, but we agree about the facts. The other type of Zionists are what are regarded as liberal Zionists, and with them, they they are just as racist, just as supremacist. They want to maintain an ethnically pure or state, or a state which has at the very least their cherished ethnic majority, but at the same time they speak the language of peace and human rights. They want to offer something to the Palestinians, not because they care about Palestinians, and I can give you that quote as well. They need actually to offer something to the Palestinians to create something that they call a Palestinian state. As a side note, there is a Palestinian state. Okay, it's called Israel. It's the same land from the river to the sea. It's all Palestine or Israel. You can call it in both ways. Now, they want to create what they call a Palestinian state because they need to separate. They are dependent on having as many Palestinians there and not here. Because for liberal Zionists, every single one of them, the most important issue is that of demographics, is that of maintaining a so-called Jewish majority, an ethnic Jewish majority. If they are not the majority, they cannot pretend to be democratic, according to them. And these are the ones who coined the phrase reaching an apartheid cliff or an apartheid threshold. People like Alon Liel, who is regarded as a leftist. He was ambassador to South Africa, Israeli ambassador to South Africa. He was, and on, and he's regarded as a raving leftist in Israel. These are the people who are so supremacist that they are dependent and they are working tirelessly to create a Palestinian state because they cannot afford the notion of actually sharing that land together because they will no longer be the majority in that land. And they are actually not the majority. The only reason that they can claim that they're a majority is because they cherry pick who they count, who they put into the formula and who they don't, and they keep 6 million people actually in forced exile just because they can.
So this is kind of the same issues that regards to the apartheid term of the whole of the of Palestine, or just the occupied.
Yes. So just for the audience, just for the audience to be clear, those people who claim to be liberal Zionists, they will speak about the thriving democracy or fighting for democracy inside what they call Israel or Israel proper, which is within the Green Line, what I call Palestine 48. It's all the same name, different names for the same thing. Inside 48, Israel proper. And there they claim that they have a democracy and they want to improve that democratic state. That military occupation of the West Bank and Gaza Strip, or Palestine 67, if you will, that they have an issue with, and they wish to give that back to the Palestinians because they are so liberal. Because that actually places their cherished so-called democracy, their cherished race state within the Green Line in jeopardy. Even if you just look at the numbers, there's already just between the river and the sea in the entire land of Palestine, without counting the refugees, there's a situation of 50-50. Actually, Palestinians are a little more than half of the population. So if they follow the right-wing notion that they want the entire land, they don't want to create a Palestinian state, they will have to acknowledge that they are no longer a majority, even without counting the refugees who are outside, those who are in exile, because there are refugees inside and the refugees outside. So you understand, they are playing this demographic game all the time, and the only way for them to feel that they're democratic and to promote their pseudo-liberal values, they are dependent on having as many Palestinians on the other side of the border.
And when we talk about this democracy of Israel, can you tell us a little bit about that, Itai, about like the actual discriminatory laws of Israel? Because I think that will be relevant as well when we discuss, is apartheid only in the occupied territories, or is it also valid inside Israel?
So this is the sophistication of the situation inside of Israel, because of course there are like the obvious laws that are from the 50s, like the absentee law that allowed confiscation of the Palestinian refugees, and there is the right to return only to Jewish people, not to Palestinians, and there are different structure, for example, that prevent Palestinians to join agricultural communities and to go to be residents, buy land in a big chunk of the Israeli sovereign state. But on the other hand, the Palestinians do participate in the Knesset, and in the election, not the last one, the one before, almost 70% of the people, Palestinian people that were allowed to vote, voted. But then there are laws that prevent them to establish a party that want to change the definition of Israel as a Jewish state. In a Knesset, a party or a nominee to the Knesset, the Israeli parliament, that want to change the definition of Israel as a Jewish state cannot participate in the political game. And if someone was already elected, and it could be proven that he is acting to change the definition of Israel, then he could be thrown out from the Knesset in a difficult procedure. But so the laws are much more sophisticated. For example, the Palestinians could privately speak on their own about the Nakba. But if there's an institute that want to do a memorial event for the Nakba while the Israelis are doing their independence celebration, then the government could cut the governmental financing and budget to this institution. So there are many sophistication, but of course, there are also the practical life of Palestinian, in which I think they suffer discrimination in all levels of bureaucracy. But we don't see in Israel like the signs that you saw in South Africa, Jewish only or not Palestinian. Palestinians are not allowed to go to the toilet or to sit there or enter there. So I think I think everybody could agree that Israel is a country based on ethnicity, the supremacy of the Jewish people, and we could agree that Israel is based on discriminatory laws. But there is a question that is debatable if these laws and this discrimination reach the level of apartheid, and it's debatable. I think it will not be so easy to convince, because as I said, the imagination is to compare to the situation in South Africa, and then there's a question if how we make people act. Because I think many people around the world still have a problem not to talk about apartheid, even to say that Israel is a racist state. So how we make people to move? So for an example, when I filed a petition to stop the Israeli arms sales to Myanmar, I did it when the Burmese military started to burn villages of the Rohingya. I didn't wait until it reached the point of genocide. Or the same in Cameroon, when there was a commando unit that went and massacred villages in the opposition area and raided universities and rape women over there. I didn't wait until the moment I got an announcement from the UN that it was the genocide. No, I don't believe like you have to do this body count. So I think it will not be easy to convince, but I think it's a very important discussion. And I think that Israel is very worried about that. There was just publication in Israel that they are considering opening again the Ministry of Strategic Issue. It was never closed, but it a bit went to sleep when Gilad Ardan moved to the UN. And now they want to open it because they're afraid that there will be a wave of decision in European countries to define Israel as an apartheid state. And we, like this is what important, like how we improve the life of Palestinian and help their liberty and right. Like I don't want for 200 years. I'm already 40 years old. I don't know how Ron is, but like I don't want. I don't want to make the Palestinian like the Tibetans. Because it's not like an historic argument. There are people that are suffering because of Israel apartheid and racial and violence policies. So I don't want like 100 years now to argue, to fight with Norwegian or Dutch people until they agree with me that it's apartheid or not. So I think it's a really important discussion, but let's not become theological about it. Like not make it as a religion, because I also believe that if Israel open a peace talk with the Palestinian, then suddenly, this is my opinion, then suddenly I believe, maybe I'm wrong, that the pressure from Amnesty, from Human Rights Watch, from different groups will be eased. Because I think it's really connected to all this report to the Netanyahu period. I want to see if there will be peace talk, if they still have the courage to say it's an apartheid situation.
So I'd like to jump in, if I may. First of all, about the peace talk that you're talking about, which I don't think that you believe in either, but you see, that's the issue. If there is an apartheid system, and I think there clearly is an apartheid system, and it is not since 1967, it's since the very foundation of the state of Israel, then the only way to abolish apartheid is to abolish it. What do you do with the slavery? You abolish slavery. What do you do with apartheid? You abolish apartheid. That's what needed to be done in South Africa. That's what is needed in Israel-Palestine. Only afterwards we can actually build something together based on everything that Israel is opposed to, based on equality and rights of minorities, multiculturalism, and so on. So it is not something that can be solved by basically diplomatic approach alone. There needs to be the abolishment of that system of oppression, terror, etc., based on racial ethnic characteristics. And that's one thing. Besides, well, okay, there were a few things that were mentioned, but yeah, I think that Israel is a much more sophisticated form of apartheid than in South Africa. In South Africa, they also made the distinction between petty apartheid and grand apartheid. We don't have the petty apartheid element. We don't have separated restaurants and separated schools, even though there are separated schools because people choose to learn separately. But by law, there is no such separation. What does exist, far greater than the grand apartheid of South Africa, is that system that differentiates between the Übermenschen and the Untermenschen, the superhumans and the subhumans, literally based on their ethnic racial characteristics. And this starts from the very foundational element, from the very first laws, like the law of return, which is the first law, and many others, which even have the term Jewish in them. There are 3 laws that explicitly use the term Jewish. Many more laws implicitly refer to the previous laws that are racist, so they're also racist by design. And also, again, we have to be clear, when Israel uses the term Jewish, it is never about religion, it is always about ethnic racial characteristics. And using the term Jewish supremacy, that is another part of that liberal Zionist propaganda, because there is no Jewish supremacy, there is a racial supremacy, which Israel calls Jewish.
I just want to go to one of the questions here, or one of the comments, because just so we do that, because I said we were going to answer the comments. So there's one here from Ivar Grappe Arnesen. He said it was mentioned that Netanyahu's turn away from democracy worsened conditions for Palestinians. From what I have heard, there's no question of Palestine in Israeli political discourse. Is this still true? And what are the discussions in Israel today, and where do we see political discourse today regarding to these issues? So is the term apartheid being discussed, like these reports that are coming? Because I think it's important to remember that these reports have been coming since, as you were Ronnie, since 2009, and I mean even before, from the Palestinian human rights organizations. And it's been documented again and again and again, and the human rights violations has been documented again and again and again, and every time it's pushed away, either by, as you mentioned before, it's international politics that happens, like September 11th, or I mean, now we have the invasion of Ukraine, which is, of course, and rightfully so, taking a lot of space here in the European media. But is this Amnesty report, has that changed anything in Israeli discourse at all? I don't know if who feels adapts to answer.
No, I don't think it changed nothing. Said I'm joking, but I could cry. But Israel is not paying a price for anything. So now the big crossroad is the UN investigation committee. If they adopt the definition of apartheid, never mind if it's a big apartheid or part apartheid, if they adopt the definition of apartheid, it could be a landmark in the recognition of the situation as apartheid, and also it will probably move forward the snowball.
Can you please can you elaborate a little bit on that? What do you mean if they adopt the definition of apartheid, and what is this investigation?
So there's an investigation established by the Human Rights Committee of the UN to investigate the situation again, like there were so many committees. But Israel is afraid, the Israeli government is afraid that they will also adopt the definition of apartheid is describing the situation in the Palestinian territories, and they also could adopt some of this definition also on Israel itself. So Israel is very worried with that because they understand that if this happens, so it will encourage the movement around the globe to recognize Israel as an apartheid state. And then maybe in the future, it could give a legal excuse for a boycott and sanction on the state of Israel. And then it will not only be the biggest movement as an activist and organization, it will be more on a state level. So I think Israel see this now what's going on in the UN committee is very important, and they try to put all the pressure that they can to prevent that. And of course, there's the story of the ICC, what will happen there. Because
and ICC is the International Criminal Court, yeah?
Yeah, I'm very skeptical about the ICC. They just decided to freeze their investigation about the Philippines. And they are worrying for their butt because they are worried how they could be sustainable politically if they go too strong on Israel. And of course, there was the sanction by the Trump administration on the ICC general prosecutor. They canceled their visa to the US, and there were other sanctions that they threatened to do. So we wait and see what will come out of that.
And also just
depends on the Palestinian. This was part of the decision by the Israeli government to designate the 6 Palestinian organizations as terrorists, because El-Haq was very important in the process in the ICC. And many times when the Palestinian Authority back off from the process in the ICC because of American and Israeli pressure, El-Haq always continued independently. So the ICC, what will come out of it is also really important.
We have to remember that the whole perception of Israel is really important for Israel and for what will happen next. So this is why it is very important to discuss apartheid and to insist that this is an apartheid regime from the very foundation, because legally it means very different things. It means there are legal obligations on countries and institutions. This is a crime against humanity, like I said, on par with genocide. Israel has been practicing occupation and colonialism and ethnic cleansing and apartheid throughout its existence. People think that the occupation started in 1967 because, again, this is what the liberal Zionist propaganda tells you. This is what you read on Haaretz newspaper. But actually, the occupation existed since the very foundation of the State of Israel until 1966. It was inside what is regarded as Israel proper, within the Green Line. Then there was 1 year when there was no occupation, and then it transitioned to the West Bank and Gaza. So, but it is much more convenient to only focus on, as we mentioned before, on the 67 issue, because there's more agreement around that in the world, that it doesn't challenge the very nature, the very character of the State of Israel. And what I'm trying to say is that actually the practice, the policies of the Israeli government are irrelevant. What matters, what is far more relevant, is challenging the very nature of that race state. And challenging the nature of a state is obviously a much more difficult goal, or much more difficult process, of course, but it also has very, very different implications.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I just want to, I see that time is always running very fast. So, and I always want to touch upon, like, so what does this mean, right, for us as solidarity organizations, as activists? How is this a change? I keep coming back to this, right? And you Itai, you kind of say you can laugh or you can cry, but it's in Israel it doesn't really. But then again, some small things do change, right? So all of a sudden we have a possibility of a UN committee actually adapting the legal term of apartheid towards Israel practices towards Palestinians, and we have I guess the internal acts from Israel of raising this ministry again that had, I believe, Iran and BDS as their main focus earlier, and now maybe then apartheid also. So for me, who's been interested in the occupation of Palestine for a long time, I see a certain movement. I see a change, not necessarily in what's going on in Palestine, but what's going on here in Norway and what's going on around the world. And I think, can you maybe say something about how these important international human rights organizations using the word of apartheid, which was, I mean, people didn't, it was, when you said that before, a room could go quiet, and now it's more, it's easier off the mouth, to put it that way. And there's one in the comments field here earlier saying that, you know, this meeting should really help us to go out and to talk about the term of apartheid to other people. So what do we do? How can we use these reports and this legal term to spread awareness about what's going on in Palestine and what we have to do here in Norway? Because I mean, you mentioned also the ICC, right? And which is the International Criminal Court. And the problem with the ICC, I was reminded today, is that they can only charge private people, not states, right? So they can charge Netanyahu for practicing apartheid, but then everyone else was like, well, you know, Netanyahu was crazy, so we'll just continue as usual. So how do we use this? How do we use this tool or this term of apartheid as a description of the massive, brutal effects of the Israeli occupation and the Israeli ethnic cleansing of Palestine? How do we use it here in Norway and around the world? I don't know. Yeah, Itai.
So I think first, if it was difficult in the past, I think like nobody should debate anymore or argue if in the 67 if it is an apartheid or not. Like, enough. It's not serious anymore. And about 48, I think the importance is that Israel and also the Trump administration wanted to bury the Palestinian refugee story. Trump administration cut the financing to UNRWA, and Israel hoped, together with the Trump administration, to bury the story of the refugees forever. So the discourse of talking about the apartheid, also 48, it brings back to the center the issue of the Palestinian refugees and the right to return, and how to make justice for them. And also, I think it's important because it helps open a discussion about the racist and violence and discrimination, daily discrimination and violence that Palestinian citizens and residents are suffering inside of Israel, and especially in East Jerusalem. So even if people agree or not that inside of 48 it's an apartheid, the minimum is that they should recognize and become more knowledgeable that the racist and violence that Palestinians are suffering inside of Israel is not acceptable. Because as Ronnie said, more of the focus was about the IDF and the Palestinian in Hebron or in Nablus. So I think it will help to also return the focus to what's happening inside 48. And of course, we should also talk about the implication, the legal application. If we think about sanctions, what type of sanction, if it should be only on the settlements or on wider supporter of the apartheid policy of Israel, because the discussion before all this report was very like focused and limited. So I think there are a lot of advantage, but also there are disadvantage, because as I said, we should think about if we should say, okay, all the UN security report about the occupation and that it's illegality, it's not important to us anymore, or it's still an important card. And also, I think like we shouldn't become religious about it, because it's we are not doing like an historical debate now. We are not talking about Columbus 500 years ago. We are talking about people that are suffering now, about refugees that are Palestinian refugees that are stuck in camps in Lebanon, in Syria, in Jordan. We're talking about Palestinian suffering in Gaza from all the circles of war that Israel committed over there, all the Israeli attacks over there. So we are talking about human beings, flesh and blood. So I think we should always look how to improve the life, and not only to be like a big theoretical. And also, I think that after Amnesty published this report, we should not let them back off. So even if there is like a peace process or whatever, we say, okay, this is your report, you have to stand on it, you have to work on it, like you have been doing on Eritrea, on Myanmar and other places. Like it's not just a station, you mark a V and then you move on. No. So we have to push all this organization that in this moment of time decided to declare apartheid to follow their declaration. Because, for example, this organization Yesh Din that announced apartheid is still going to the Israeli court, which I think is problematic, to say that the Israeli system is apartheid and still go to the court system. So I think like all the organizations that claim it's apartheid should also be accountable to the Palestinian and to the activist community.
Yeah. First of all, like that organization, Yesh Din, that still goes to the Israeli court, etc. I mean, they have totally whitewashed. They totally whitewashed Israeli crimes. I mean, they specifically wrote a report that explicitly deals with apartheid in the occupied territories, and they refuse to deal with any other element of Israeli apartheid, and that is a really shameful report. I listed it in that table. But the questioner before, he asked about the perception of apartheid inside Israel, among Israeli society. And my response is, first of all, nothing has changed. And I don't think that anything has changed in Israeli society, or almost nothing has changed in Israeli society's thinking since the very foundation of the State of Israel. Maybe the discourse has shifted a little, which has become even less apologetic than before, or meaning more explicitly racist, where it was maybe more apologetic and more progressive. Now it is less apologetic and less progressive. But what really changes is the perception outside. And this is the success of the BDS campaign. And this is due to the what we see now, this whole shifting narrative from occupation to apartheid, for example. It's not only the occupation. there's also apartheid. Where is apartheid defined? Is it only within this territory? Is it throughout the land? Is it even beyond the land? Also applicable to the refugees languishing in refugee camps and elsewhere? That is the question that we should be asking and demanding, actually, to be investigated. And that shifting narrative and the shifting perception of Israel is crucial in order to change anything, because nothing will change by itself. Israel does everything it does with full impunity. When I say full impunity, I mean full impunity. Every single member state of the EU, for example, is obligated by law, by their own agreements with Israel. There's the EU-Israel Association Agreement, which clarifies about, which manages the whole trade, and more than just trade with Israel. And Article 2 of that agreement is a legally binding clause that says that if there is a consistent human rights violation in Israel, then the entire agreement is null and void. They can take corrective measures, they can sanction, they can do all sorts of things. What they are not allowed to do by their own laws and European law is to carry on with business as usual with Israel. What every single member state of the EU does since that agreement was signed is to look the other way and protect Israel and allow Israel to carry on with its criminal policies. And this is where we should step in and demand of our elected representatives, etc., simply to live up to their agreements. And if this is not good enough, this should be challenged in the European Court, and the same wherever that takes place. And if this becomes much more important the moment we move from occupation to apartheid, or the moment we shift the discourse towards something that is by law regarded as a crime against humanity. What do Israelis think about the situation? I couldn't care less. Did it matter what white people think about South African apartheid at the time in South Africa? No. And obviously no privileged group will just step off their high horse and accept the notion of equality, but they will have to live with it. It doesn't mean that they will stop being Zionist overnight, but they will have to accept that this is not for them and only for them, that land should respect the rights of all 20 million people of that land. And I go back to the number. There are 20 million people, roughly 20 million people living under Israeli apartheid. Roughly 7 million are among the privileged group that Itai and I belong to, and roughly 12 million are among the underprivileged group that suffer from basically the fact that the entire system lends privileges to people like ourselves. And these 12 million are in different locations around the world, suffering different consequences of apartheid, but they all suffer from Israeli apartheid, each and to a different degree.
Yeah, it's I think the part of Israeli attempt to divide the Palestinians into the Israeli Palestinians and the West Bank Palestinians and the Gaza Palestinians and the G Palestinians, and the fact that with the recent uprising of the Unity Intifada and the Palestinian coming together as one people again, or they've always been one people, but to fight this separation that Israel is trying to force upon them, is at least a positive sign of the struggles continuing. And I think, of course, as you said, what Israelis mean it doesn't really matter that much, because if the oppressor is ashamed of oppressing, he's still oppressing. So, but the fight continues, that's for sure. The struggle continues, and I think this apartheid tool will be at least useful, because it's as you mentioned, Itai, it's embarrassing to be called an apartheid state, I think, and I think that's where maybe we should just try to press him where it hurts the most, and make sure this new ministry, or this renewed ministry, has a lot of work to do. But I would like to thank you both for participating today. It's been very interesting to listen to you, and I hope that you the people listening got some new inklings on the apartheid question. So I'm just going to finish in Norwegian now, but I want to thank you both very, very much for taking part in this monthly meeting with Morten. So thanks, guys. Ok, da skal jeg bare avslutte med å si tusen takk til alle som fulgte møtet I dag. Håper at vi kom inn på noen interessante vinklinger I forhold til apartheidspørsmålet og apartheidrapportene. Jeg vil oppfordre alle som ikke har meldt seg inn I Palestina-komiteen allerede til å gjøre det. Det veldig, veldig enkelt. Du finner all informasjon du trenger om det på palestinakomiteen.no/medlem. Det koster bare 100 kroner første året å være medlem. Og så vil jeg oppfordre alle der ute som medlem av en organisasjon, eller en klubb, eller en bedrift, til å sjekke ut Palestina-komiteens kampanje Apartheidfrie soner. Dette en kampanje hvor man erklærer seg som en apartheidfri zone, altså en organisasjon eller bedrift som ikke kjøper eller selger produkter som bidrar til menneskerettighetsbrudd. Du vil finne mer informasjon om det også inne på palestinakomiteen.no. Per I dag så har vi nesten 100 apartheidfrie zoner I Norge, og vi håper at vi klarer å få veldig mange flere. Og så til slutt vil jeg bare si tusen takk for alle som har fulgt Månedens Møte med Morten så langt. Dette faktisk det siste møtet som jeg kommer til å ha. Neste møte, det skjer etter landsmøtet I Palestina-komiteen, som vi skal ha I slutten av mars. Og da tar jeg ikke gjenvalg som nestleder, så da det en annen som kommer til å ha dette månedlige møtet med dere. Men vi kommer til å ha månedlige møter fortsatt fra Palestina-komiteen, så jeg håper at dere blir med meg og ser på alle de møtene som kommer fram I tid. Så da vil jeg bare si tusen takk alle sammen for at dere var med, og så ses vi. Takk skal dere ha. Ha det, ha det.